Buonasera a tutti, good evening everybody. Tonight is the second conversation of the series about exile and creativity. The first one was dedicated to Fermi, and the next one, on 25th of April, will concern the politicians. It's a series about Italian who had to leave Italy for political or racial reasons and decide to come to the United States. Sometimes they remain here, sometimes they went back to Italy after the war, and we decide to investigate about how this forced trip, this leaving from Italy, influenced their life and their works, and sometimes also how influenced the life, the cultural life of the United States and also of Italy. Tonight we will have a conversation about Arturo Toscanini between James Conlon, who is very well-known conductor, and Harvey Sachs, that is a friend of the Institute. We did a lot of things together. James Conlon is American. He is the music director of the Los Angeles Opera and the principal conductor of the Italian Rai National Symphony Orchestra. He was the long-serving director of the two-week Cincinnati May Festival from 1979 through 2016. From 2005 to 2015, he was music director at the Ravinia Festival, the summer home of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He is known for his efforts in reviving music by composers suppressed during the Nazi regime, and this is one of the reasons why we invite him. Harvey Sachs is an American Canadian Swiss, I don't know, okay, writer who has written many books on musical subjects. He is the creator of our series of conversation with Italian conductors here at the Institute, but in this case is the author of and I want to underline the biography of Arturo Toscanini, musician of conscience, which is the fantastic result of a long-lasting work, a life work, I think, of Harvey Sachs on Toscanini. So please enjoy.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. Welcome, everybody. Very pleased to have you here this evening, and particularly pleased to have my good friend James Conlon here with us. I wanted, in fact, to start by asking Maestro Conlon to speak a little bit maybe about his Italian. I know he has some Italian roots, and also his long connection with Italy, musical connection.
Well, buried under that Irish name, I had an Italian grandmother and a German grandfather, so I'm a bit of a passer in that regard. So, yes, those are my Italian roots. From a family point of view, but my real Italian roots start, I suppose, when I was 11, and I totally fell in love with classical music, and specifically because I attended a performance of La Traviata, and then right after that, the Barbarossa di Siviglia. So that really goes from there. I went to Italy the first time when I was 20 with the Juilliard Orchestra. I was a student at Juilliard, and that particular summer, the Juilliard Orchestra was invited to go to Spoleto. In those days, it wasn't necessary to say Spoleto in Umbria because there was no Spoleto festival in Charleston. It gets me very upset nowadays for people to be very surprised that there's actually a place called Spoleto in Umbria. But those were the days when you didn't have to explain that to anybody. And I signed up as an assistant conductor, and that was my first step in Europe, and of course, consequently, the beginning of my Italian adventure. Of the following year, I was invited back as a real assistant. That means I played rehearsals and conducted backstage, and because it was Boris Godunov, the opera, there were bells to bang on and things like that. And in return for my coaching and all that work, I got to perform. Well, I got to conduct one performance, and that was literally the first time I ever conducted a performance. So my professional operatic life, at least, started in Spoleto and consequently in Italy. And from that time on, there's been no time in my life that I haven't been going to Italy. I started conducting more often later on in the 70s, and I think the big change came in 1985 when I conducted Don Carlo to open the Maggio Musicale Fiorentino in Florence, before Maestro van Straten was there, but that was really the beginning. From that point on, I never stopped. That's 1985, so it's now over 30 years, and spent now I've been at the RAI in Torino for the last 3 years, and but many other places as well. I love Italy. I make no secret of it. That's I think it's a well-known fact in the industry. So I first met Maestro van Straten when he was intendant in Firenze, and I have to say I also met Maestro Sachs. Also, in when I was in Florence, and I think the year was 1996, and I was conducting Macbeth of Verdi, and a wonderful mutual and beloved friend of ours, David Garlop, said, "Come on, we're going to the country." He referred to you as the country. We went to some small town, I don't even remember what it was called, to visit Harvey. He's my great friend Harvey, whom of course I had heard about, and his writings. At that time, there was the first Toscanini book, and so that's how we met. So we are friends and colleagues now for 30 years. So I'm very happy to be here with you today, Harvey.
Thank you. I would like to start by very briefly summarizing the life and career of Toscanini. It's very hard to summarize 90 years in a few minutes, especially when they were as full as his life and career were. But I just want to give a picture of how all these different parts fit together. So Toscanini was born in Parma in 1867. He attended the conservatory there, graduated when he was 18 with highest honors. The following year he was invited to be principal cello and assistant chorus master of an Italian opera company that was touring in South America. And while they were in Brazil, he was called upon at the last minute to conduct Aida, which was at that time Verdi's most recent opera, when the company's conductor suddenly resigned. It was a big success, and he conducted the rest of the season, 12 operas, rehearsed and conducted them all from memory at the age of 19. He had a photographic memory, which, was a big help. So he came back to Italy, conducted in provincial opera houses mostly for several years. There were some major events also. In 1892, when he was 25, he conducted the world premiere of Pagliacci of Leoncavallo. When he was 29, he became what we would today call principal conductor and artistic director of the Teatro Regio in Turin. And there he conducted, among many other things, the Italian premiere of Wagner's Götterdämmerung and the world premiere of La Bohème. In 1898, he became music director of La Scala, very important 5-year period there. Again, he conducted many important premieres, some of them of operas that have long since been forgotten, but also the Italian premieres of Wagner's Siegfried and Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin, and so on and so forth. So, very busy time. He had a big fight with La Scala in 1903. He quit. He conducted quite a bit in South America, specifically in Buenos Aires, in several different seasons. Gave, among other things, the South American premieres of Tristan and a staged version of Berlioz's Damnation of Faust. He came back to La Scala in 1906 for 2 seasons, conducted, again, among much else, the Italian premieres of Salome and Pelléas et Mélisande. Resigned in 1908 because he was offered a position as co-conductor of the Metropolitan Opera in New York with Gustav Mahler. Quite a team. And so he was here for 7 years with the Met, very important years for him and for the ensemble. Returned to Italy in 1915 for a variety of reasons, but among them the fact that Italy was about to enter the First World War on the side of Britain, France, and Russia. And Toscanini was a patriot, and he wanted to be there to support his country. And in fact, for the entire duration of the First World War, he gave only benefit concerts. He did not earn a penny through that entire period, and he and his family, then he was married and had 3 children, they had to sell their house in Milan because they had run out of money. So after the war, he returned to La Scala as kind of dictator of the ensemble, again, what we would call both music director and artistic director, and he was there for 8 seasons that remain historical in the history of La Scala and in the history of opera. And in 1926, he began splitting his seasons between La Scala and the New York Philharmonic, and became, in fact, principal conductor of the Philharmonic in 1930. He also took the orchestra on its first European tour that year and made a tremendous splash in Europe, because Europeans had thought that, you know, America was kind of a frontier outpost, culturally speaking, and they discovered that there was no European orchestra that could play as well as the New York Philharmonic at that time. So also in 1930, he became the first non-German school conductor to conduct at the Bayreuth Festival in Germany. Again, tremendous success. Could return there in 1931, but refused to return in 1933 because in the meantime Adolf Hitler had come to power in Germany. He began doing more guest conducting in the mid-30s as a result of this. He had never wanted to do much guest conducting before that. He preferred to work steadily with 1 or 2 organizations. But as a result of the political situation, which of course was becoming much rougher also in Italy, where Mussolini had been in power since 1922, he began to do more and more work with orchestras like the Vienna Philharmonic. He also conducted at the Salzburg Festival. He conducted the BBC Symphony, and so on and so forth. He sort of created a circle around the Nazi fascist countries. And in 1931, he was beaten by fascist hooligans before a concert in Bologna. And at that point, he made up his mind that he would not conduct again in Italy as long as the regime and the monarchy were in place, because he blamed the monarchy for the durability of the fascist regime. He went to Palestine in 1936 at his own expense to conduct the inaugural concerts of what is now the Israel Philharmonic, to show his solidarity with Jewish musicians who were fleeing from Nazi persecution, and returned there again at his own expense and with no fee in 1938 to conduct again. He retired from the New York Philharmonic in 1936. He felt that doing 5 rehearsals and 4 concerts a week was getting to be too much for him. He was approaching 70 at that point, But the following year, David Sarnoff, the chairman of the board of Radio Corporation of America, invited him to return to New York to conduct a radio orchestra, the NBC Symphony, that was created specifically for him. And it was a much easier gig, as we would say today, because he did his rehearsals, but there was only 1 hour-and-a-half broadcast each week. So it was a much easier task for him to undertake. And it was fortunate that he did come back at that point, because in 1938 he began to have really serious problems with the fascists in Italy. His passport was confiscated and then given back to him, and so on and so forth. He came to the United States then in the fall of '38 as a real exile. And so he remained here then through the war years. I should also mention that in '38, when he refused to return to the Salzburg Festival after the Nazi takeover, he helped to create the Lucerne Festival. It was his agreeing to go there to conduct some concerts that attracted other musicians, and of course that festival is about to celebrate its 80th anniversary this year. He continued to conduct the NBC Symphony through the war years. He did a lot of benefit concerts for the Red Cross, for war bonds, and so on. And he continued to conduct until his retirement in 1954 at the age of 87, and died here at his home in Riverdale shortly before his 90th birthday in 1957. So it was a very long, very full life. He's, as best as I've been able to calculate, had a repertoire of about 600 works, all rehearsed and conducted from memory, and a very wide-ranging repertoire. So, and of course, the main thing is that he was a very influential person in the history of conducting, in the history of musical interpretation. But this is a whole other area that we unfortunately, we don't have time to go into in detail here, because the focus is on his years as, or his stand against fascism and Nazism. I wanted to read you, if I may, a few very brief excerpts from my book, because it's much easier than trying to talk about these things off the cuff. And these are things that have specifically to do with his political stand. Now, Toscanini was not political in the normal sense of the word. He was not interested in this party as opposed to that party. He had, in 1919, supported this new party that was at the extreme left of a former socialist journalist named Benito Mussolini, which had a program at that time of abolition of the banks and the stock exchange, abolition of ecclesiastical property, universal vote for women and men, not necessarily property holders, creating a constituent assembly that would be part of an international constituent assembly. It was almost a Bolshevik-like platform. Well, of course, it was defeated, and Mussolini decided, first of all, he lost his taste for elections, but also he decided that it was better to go to the extreme right than to the extreme left. He would perhaps have more success there because he couldn't beat the socialists at their own game. So Toscanini, at the time of the March on Rome of the fascists in October of 1922, he told his friend Eugenio Balzan at the Corriere della Sera, if I were capable of killing a man, I would kill Mussolini. This was at the very, very beginning, before it was a dictatorship. And through the 20s at La Scala, he had more and more problems with the regime, which tried to impose more and more rules and regulations on all places of public entertainment, as well as everything else in the daily life of the country. What I want to read first is an excerpt from, at the time when he was, as I mentioned before, physically attacked in Bologna for refusing to play the fascist party's hymn before a concert. He was attacked by some young fascist thugs. He sent a telegram to Mussolini immediately afterwards, and he wrote, "Last evening, while going with my family to Bologna's Teatro Comunale to carry out a kind act of friendship and love in memory of Giuseppe Martucci, who was a well-known Italian composer who had been a friend of Toscanini's, having been invited there by the mayor of the city for a religious and artistic commemoration, not for a gala evening, I was attacked, injured, and repeatedly struck on the face by a contemptible gang. The Undersecretary of the Interior was present in Bologna. Not fully satisfied with this, the gang, its ranks swollen, stood threateningly under the windows of the Hotel Brun, where I was staying, uttering every sort of insult and threat against me. Not only that, one of its leaders enjoined me, through Maestro Respighi, to leave the city by 6 a.m., not being able to guarantee my safety otherwise. I am communicating this to Your Excellency so that despite the silence of the press or false information, Your Excellency will be able to have precise news of the deed, and so that the deed be remembered." So that was the first really big run-in with the regime, 1931. I want now to jump to 1938, and this is a very interesting situation because in 38, he had had tremendous success at the Salzburg Festival. The attendance there, once he started conducting there, had leapt from 60-something% to 98% for each of the festival seasons, and they depended on him to come back. So in February of 38, when the then Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg made his very first compromise with Hitler by putting in one Nazi minister in the Austrian government, Seyss-Inquart, as Minister of the Interior, Toscanini, the next or 2 days later, cabled the festival that he would not return that summer. And very interestingly, a lot of his friends, including his Jewish friends in Vienna, said, no, you're jumping the gun, don't, it's not that bad, you'll see, everything will be fine. He then wrote that, I just want to find the right place here. Bruno Walter wrote to him and told him, Bruno Walter, his colleague and friend, conductor, who was in effect more or less the music director of the Salzburg Festival officially, he sent him a telegram saying, "Please come back, I'm going to send you a long letter explaining how things are." Toscanini didn't wait for the letter. He sent Walter a telegram. "Futile to await your letter. My decision, however painful, is final. I have only one way of thinking and acting. I hate compromise. I walk and I shall always walk on the straight path that I have traced for myself in life." This was typical of him. And of course, 1 month later, the German army marched into Austria, and that was the end of that. But, oh yes, just before that, after he had cabled the festival that he was not coming back, they sent him a cable about 3 weeks later, the festival's administration, and they cabled him to ask that he communicate within the next few days whether or not he would in fact come back. Otherwise, we are forced to consider your renunciation final. Toscanini cabled them, "I am surprised by your insulting telegram. and I am surprised that the finality of my decision was not already understood from my first cable. Again, very typical of his way of doing things. Many reactions to his decision came through. The one that I found most touching was a letter that was sent to him by Gaetano Salvemini, who was probably the most important Italian historian of the first half of the 20th century, and who was also an exile from fascist Italy. And Salvemini wrote to him, and this is an excerpt from the Salvemini was then a professor of history at Harvard. He wrote to him, "In these Borgia-like years, you are the only person whose moral light remains steady amid the universal baseness. You are the only one who, at those important moments when we were lost in the darkness of despair, shouted words of faith, duty, and hope at us. Fate has not been so adverse today as may seem at first glance to be the case to those of us who have been scattered through the world by the tempest. To those cowards who bow down before the great beast, taking it to be Italy, we can teach that Italy is today represented not by Mussolini, but by Toscanini. May our Italy live forever, the Italy of Mazzini, which still continues through you, dear maestro, to speak to the world in terms worthy of its history and its nobility." Well, I think that's enough, the excerpts, but you know, it was his stand that inspired many other people. He was certainly, it's very hard today to, when, you know, to a great extent, classical music has been marginalized, and I think we talked about this some time ago. At that, when he conducted the New York Philharmonic, 9 million Americans would listen to the broadcasts every week. That was about 7% of the entire population of the country. So when he made these decisions, they were front page news. And whereas he had always been against, he never gave interviews, he was very much against being in the public eye, this was important for him. And when these things happened, he was glad that news of it was spread around because he felt so strongly about this. So I would like, before we talk more, I just want to show you the first 10 or 12 minutes of a film that was made, a propaganda film that was made in 1944 by the US Office of War Information. And it was made in order to send, it was meant to be sent to the parts of Europe, and especially Italy, that were being retaken by the Allies. It's about a half-hour-long film. It's called The Hymn of the Nations. And in the beginning, you see the part I'm going to show because it's too long to show the whole thing. But we're going to see Toscanini conducting the NBC Symphony Orchestra in the Overture to La Forza del Destino of Verdi. And then you'll see him briefly at home with his grandson, who was then 14, at home at Wave Hill, by the way, here in the Bronx. And then you will see various other Italian anti-fascist exiles, including Salvemini, whom I just mentioned. It is a propaganda film, and there's a point in the overture when, you know, you'll see the amber waves of grain and the antennas and microphones and everything else to show, you know, how wonderful America is. But it's quite an impressive film, also because it's the first sound film that actually shows Toscanini conducting. He was 77, almost 77 when this film was made. So, shall we have the deal?
radio brings the music of Arturo Toscanini to millions of Americans. America has taken Toscanini to its heart, not only as a musician of unmatchable talent, but also as a champion of democracy. In his house above the Hudson River near New York, he has found a haven of freedom for his children and grandchildren. But his thoughts have never been far from his beloved Italy. Americans know that this son of a soldier of Garibaldi refused to allow his music to become the servant of tyrants. They know that 20 years ago he took his stand against the tyranny of fascism in his own land. When the fascists rose to power in Germany, Toscanini withdrew from Beirut. When Austria was forced into the Reich, Toscanini was heard no more at Salzburg. And when the night of fascism darkened most of continental Europe, he brought his music and his democratic faith to the New World. He was not alone. Other Italians who preferred exile to slavery were carrying on the fight in America. Gaetano Salvemini, the historian, lectured to young Americans in the classrooms of Harvard University. G.A. Borghese at the University of Chicago taught American boys and girls to understand and love Italian literature. And some kept the dream of a free Italy alive through the press. In New York, Giuseppe Lucas, Aurelio Natoli, Carlo Aprato fought fascism with their pens. So did Colonel Randolfo Pacciardi, soldier and editor. Don Sturzo, priest and patriot, preached democracy and the Christian ideal from his refuge in Florida. For 20 years, these men had waited and fought and hoped.
You can watch the rest of this on YouTube if you want. There's a beautiful performance of the Hymn of the Nations, Verdi. So now I want to move on, and first of all, I should mention the fact that even after the war, Toscanini continued to make his center of activity here in New York. He had this fantastic orchestra at his disposal, and you know, it was he no longer wanted to conduct staged opera. He felt it was too much for him, and so that's why he continued to, although he would go back to Italy every year for a period, but his work was continued to be centered here. I would like to ask Maestro Conlon, first of all, what does Toscanini mean to you? I mean, his example as a human being and as a conductor.
Well, first of all, if you're a conductor and you look up to Toscanini, when there's no other way to look, and you feel, well, you know, can any of us ever achieve that? The answer is no, and then you go home and you pull your head under the covers of your bed and you remain there for the rest of your life. His stature is not an accident. His stature is because he was so, his genius in all aspects of music is so extraordinary and inexplicable that he stands as a conductor the way, for instance, Mozart stands as a composer. There is no explanation for Arturo Toscanini. And so all of those growing up after the fact always, you know, are very highly conscious of what was possible for a human being to do, but that none of us can do that. So he was always an ideal in the sense that that was the highest the highest peak in our profession. but from there on, you have to be whom you are and what you do. Now, I missed him. Of course, I was alive in his last years, but I was too young to go to to have any awareness of him or music. But as soon as I did become aware of music in the 60s, of course, I started, learning about him and started, of course, going to the New York Public Library, which for me was the great source of education. That's where the books were, that's where the scores were, that's where the records even were. So I started here in Toscanini, traipsing back and forth to, it was the Donnell Library at that time, and then later to Lincoln Center, but just borrowing as many of his recordings. And so by the time I finished high school, I went to the High School of Music and Art, I must have heard 50 or 60 recordings of Toscanini. So there's no question, the imprint, that Toscanini was what it meant to be the greatest conductor. And I have been sometimes distressed in recent years, reading various critics bashing him about, saying, oh, Italian bandmaster and things like that. And, not so much here in the United States, but in certain areas that are close to Europe, where I resented that, and I could only understand it to one small degree. It's a question of taste. One may or may not, as a question of taste, like every performance they have heard of Toscanini on recordings, but
he didn't like all of
that's
them.
what he would agree. But the fact is that judged by the standards of today, it is easily forgotten that he is responsible for the standards of today's orchestras and today's the height of the whole development. He accompanied and led, more than accompanied, the entire development of the modern symphony orchestra and what could be expected of them. So if for those who wish to criticize and say, well, I don't like this sound, or I don't like these tempi, and it should be noted that most of the recordings, Toscanini did get faster as he got older. Apparently there are two types of conductors. I'm still waiting to see which type I am. Those that get faster and those that get slower after a certain point in their lives. He certainly did get faster. And if you hear, there are recordings from the 1920s and the famous La Scala acoustics, and then you can find things from the 30s. You will see that no question that he got faster as he got older. So that actually, I would say maybe 80% of the recordings that we actually hear, and certainly all of those from the NBC, are in his last decade or last 15 years. So they are very fast. But rather than to criticize, you can criticize, but rather one should not lose sight of the fact that we are judging by standards that he created for us, and left that with the world after his retirement and death.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. As I said, he himself, and I've had the privilege in writing this book to listen to tapes, conversations that were recorded unbeknownst to him in his last years. And he is very critical of his own recordings and performances. And sometimes when people would come over and pray, oh, I heard this or that, and he'd say, are you crazy? You know, that was a terrible performance. I heard the recording of it, and it was terrible. So he was very self-critical, and it's true that as a general tendency in his later years, the tempi tended to get faster. Not always, but that was a general tendency. But getting back to the purpose of this evening, talking about Toscanini and his political stand, what do you think? Should artists become involved in questions of, of course, as I said before, he was not interested in party politics as such. But when something became too horrible to put up with, in his opinion, he then said no. a lot of people in the arts today are becoming more involved in one way or another in political questions. Do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, or neither the one nor the other?
Well, I would start. These are my own viewpoints, obviously. I think every citizen has a responsibility to speak out in whatever manner they feel is appropriate. So artists should not be excluded from their roles as citizens. When you ask, well, what is your specific activity as an artist? I also believe that as long as I'm on the stage, I am an apolitical person. I mean, when I'm on the concert stage, I'm not up there to put across my political views. I am there as a conduit, as a vessel for letting the essence of a musical composition pass through me to an audience, therefore apolitical, unless it happens to be a piece which itself is political. So when I perform, no politics, but as a citizen I am free and have the same responsibility as every other citizen has to, in one way or the other, speak their mind or try to bring about whatever changes, resist whatever might need resistance. And so I think the artist and the human being are two different things, even though we have two different functions. Let's put it that way.
You have been involved, very deeply involved, in trying to recoup music that by composers who were in one way or another either physically eliminated by the Nazis, or whose music had in one way or another been sort of sidetracked and never taken up again. And Maestro Conlon has been very active with his Recovered Voices series in with the Los Angeles Opera, and also in creating the Orel Foundation, in trying to bring these people back to life as they deserve. Could you talk a little bit about those enterprises and what caused you to take that course?
Well, this is a mission. I don't think of it as an enterprise, or some people ask me how long are you going to do this project. It is not a project, it is a mission. I became interested in certain composers whose music had been suppressed during the Nazi era almost over 20 years ago. The interest in one composer led to reading and hearing about other composers until the moment where I had an epiphany. If I don't know music by X and I don't know music by Y, there is an artificial or an arbitrary reason, and that arbitrary reason was the suppression by the Nazi regime. Considering, I would say that I, started eating, sleeping, and drinking music at the age of 11, have never stopped. The fact that I was over 40 years old, before I even became aware of how profound or how enormous the volume of music that we don't know, it's not a surprise that the public would not know, and nobody's at fault, or I should say nobody today is at fault for not knowing their music. The fault lies clearly with the many crimes of the Nazi regime, amongst them to suppress artists, writers, music. And so I started simply by performing these, recording some of these works, and then as time went on, I became more and more convinced that something had to be done about it on a larger scale. That's in the years when I lived in Germany and France. When I came back to the United States, which is just a little bit over a decade ago, I decided to try to do as much as I could here to raise consciousness. Maybe the first and most primary step was to create a website and then to fill it with as much information as possible about these composers, because inevitably when I would give a concert, people came up to me and said, I want to hear more about this, how can I learn more about it? And there was barely any place to send them, to the degree that there was literature, much of it was in German. There was no place that you could go to find out who these persons were. So now the Orel Foundation, that's spelled O-R-E-L, has a website, well, we've had it actually now for 12 or 15 years, is a website where you and everybody else can go to find out the specific history of about 25 composers. You can get full biography, you can find a list of all of their works. We have many articles that we write on all sorts of subjects, ranging from, or I would say, taking aspects of the question, their application in contemporary life now. Why is it important that we know this music? And so it's called the Orell Foundation. We're not a foundation at all. We get letters all the time saying, oh, I would love to do this project, can you help fund it? And I write back and said, actually we're a foundation that needs money, not a foundation that has any money. So, but there are basically three reasons to, in my mind, to revive this music. One is a moral reason, to undo the injustices that were meted out to these composers, either through their murder, through their forced exile, their forced displacement, and very much so for the banning of their music exactly at the time of their lives and history when their music, had it been played, would have taken, I believe, taken root and had traction today. So there's a moral reason, there's a historic reason that whenever new information becomes available to any historian who studies a certain period in history, there's almost an obligation to revisit history with this new information. So whether that be the Chinese Empire, the Persian Empire, pre-Columbian South America, the Civil War, the last 20 years of elections in the United States, whatever it is, there's always new information coming up. There is new information, not in the sense that anything of these composers is new, but the fact that it was ignored and wasn't discussed, and wasn't, it represents a big hole in the writing of the history of classical music in the 20th century. The 20th century has much more to it than we commonly know. And the third and most important reason is the artistic reason. Because we have lost something that is a part of the cultural heritage of Western civilization that we value, that is to say classical music. And as those who have inherited that tradition, those of us who perform it, those of us who play it, those of us who listen to it, those of us who love it, there's a big chunk of music there that has never really had its day on the concert stages and in the opera houses of the world. And so I'm not proposing that every piece of music that was written by every victim of the Nazi Germany should be being played. There are value judgments, and obviously I'm judging some of this to be of a value that should be played. But none of that would have relevance if the artistic value was not significant. After and when one would acquaint yourself with this music, you can judge whether you like it or not, and that's fine. You know, some people like Brahms, some people like Bruckner, some people like Verdi, some people like Wagner, some people like all of it, like me. But we all do pick and choose what we like, and it's fine if then people pick and choose from the composers whose music had been suppressed and played. That's fine to pick and choose what you like, but only after you know it. And so blanket observations like, well, I don't know it, it can't be good. You know, the best product always rises to the top. Why isn't it written to the top? We know why it hasn't risen to the top, because it didn't get a chance to have its real life at the time of the Nazi regime.
I was just thinking about when I had I don't remember, was this 4 or 5 years ago that you did the Schreker Die Gezeichneten in Los Angeles, which I had the privilege of being present at. I believe that was the US premiere, was it not?
Well, it was not only the US premiere of one of the 13 operas of Franz Schreker, who incidentally was one of the most successful composers during his lifetime, to the point of being compared to or identified as the successor to Wagner and Strauss. That's pretty big. That's a pretty big deal. Now that may be slightly overinflated, but the fact is he was successful. The performance of Die Gezeichneten, don't try to figure out what that means. We're still trying to figure it out. We called it the stigmatized, It's a complex and complicated opera with a complicated title. But that was the first stage production of any Schreker opera in the United States. And that's just, it's not yet 10 years ago. So there's a lot to be done.
And I remember reading at the time, or perhaps you told me, that in fact, before the Nazis came to power, Schreker was second to Richard Strauss in number of performances of his operas in Germany, and then nothing, absolutely nothing after that.
That's a measure of the destruction of the Nazis. And also, as an anecdote, his wife told the story that when she returned to Berlin after the war, she could not find a single copy of any piece of music of Franz Schreker. And he had fallen under particular the venom of the Nazis even before they took power in 1933. They removed him from his position as director of the Hochschule in Berlin, which was the highest academic post in, that was like being, I don't know, the president of Harvard or something. That's the equivalent in Germany. That's where he was, and they hounded him out of that position and put enormous pressure on him personally for the next few years, until such point that it had an effect on his health, and he had a premature death.
Yes. Also, I wanted to mention there were many Italian composers who also suffered under the fascist regime, not at first, but once the racial laws were put in effect in 1938. There were a number of composers who were forced to leave, or who stayed and were completely forgotten, and some of them were persecuted during the German occupation, especially in the north of Italy in 1943, 44, 45. So yes, a number of them came here. I mean, the most famous example is Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, who became a film composer in Hollywood and was the teacher of John Williams and Andre Previn, among other things. So this happened also in Italy. But, you know, fortunately, under the Italian regime, there wasn't actual physical persecution of them. And in fact, I'll tell you a very funny story that was told to me by Giampiero Tintori, who used to be long gone, unfortunately, but was a wonderful head of the Theatrical Museum at La Scala for many years and knew everything about everything. And he had been a student at the Milan Conservatory in 37, 38, and he told me that just after the racial laws were published, there was a student recital, and the student who was a violinist, student who was to play, was going to play a capriccio or a fantasy by Wieniawski. And as he was about to go and perform, the director of the conservatory came and said, "Wait a minute, was Wieniawski Jewish?" And nobody knew, actually he was, but nobody knew. And so they came up with what I consider the perfect Italian solution. The kid comes out on stage and he says, "Instead of playing a fantasy by Wieniawski, I'm going to play a fantasy by an unknown composer." And they played the fantasy by Wieniawski. Perfect solution. So I think perhaps we can open to questions and answers, and you know, unless there's something specific that you would like to add about.
Well,
this.
I gave a speech at the Neue Galerie last night. That they had to stop me at 2 hours, and it wasn't finished before I had to say. So don't give me the floor, but I will be happy with Harvey to take any questions you wish to pose.
What happened to the Toscanini archives? I believe that they are either at Yale or Princeton. Because I remember I was very friendly with Toscanini's granddaughter, Emanuela Castelbarco, and the last time she came to New York, she was very upset with her cousin because she wanted the archives to go back to Italy, while her cousin wanted the archives to stay here. So what happened?
I can tell you, in 1982, I wrote an article for the Corriere della Sera saying, Toscanini's, the family's archives are packed up in the basement of the library at Lincoln Center, and somebody should do something about it. And there was not one response from any institution in Italy, not one. So, when in 1986, the archives, which had been mostly created by Toscanini's son, Walter, who was the one who really cared about collecting everything, and when he became ill in the late 60s and had to leave the house in Riverdale, they packed everything up, they put everything in the bottom, apparently filled 23 moving vans. I mean, scores, recordings, documents, everything. And because one member of the Toscanini family, Mrs. Horowitz, I can say it now because she's long gone, wanted to be paid a considerable sum of money for the archives, they just languished there for many years. And in 1986, when the tax laws were about to change, she suddenly decided that they had to get rid of them. So, at that point, the family agreed that they would go to the New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, which is where they are today. And Valfredo Toscanini, Emanuela's cousin, and later on they had very good relations once again. Valfredo, whom you saw in the film there at the age of 14, was worried about it at the time because there weren't, he felt, enough guarantees from the library about how they would use the material. On the other hand, they had been sitting there for 18 years, and he figured, if my aunts are going to sign this, I have to sign it too. So the bulk of the archives are there in the library at Lincoln Center. Then the material that belonged to Emanuela Castelbarco, the daughter of Valli Toscanini, the elder of Toscanini's two daughters, all of that material that she kept is now in the Archivio di Stato, the state archive in Milan, in Via Senato. And it's been cataloged just fairly recently. And there's a lot of interesting material there too. I'll give you one example. When Toscanini in 1908 conducted the Italian premiere of Peleas, he was in touch with Debussy. And Debussy sent him a piano vocal score in which he made changes in the vocal line. And Toscanini, underneath, made changes in the Italian translation because that production was sung in Italian. And so that score is there. If anybody wants to see what changes Debussy made in the vocal line of Peleas, it's there. But here, there's a tremendous amount of material. There's also in various other places. There is at Yale, there's the material that Wanda Horowitz, the other daughter, gave to, mostly about her husband, Vladimir Horowitz, but there is some Toscanini material as well. And there are, scattered here and there at the Parma Conservatory where he went to school, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of material in a lot of different places. So but the main things are in those two places. Yes, sir?
I can attest to the presence of this material. About 16 years ago, I prepared the performing edition of Verdi's Overture to Aida, which he suppressed. And the only place that we knew we could get orchestra material was in Toscanini's collection. I was sent there into the bowels of the research. In those days, they still had the research collection. You had to get a special tessera, a special identification to get in.
They still do.
That's kind of good to know, because I heard that you could just sort of wander around with that stuff, and that would be horrible. But I remember the librarian brought me one of these large archival boxes and opened it, and I realized that I had before me the performing parts not only of this piece, but of 7 or 8 Beethoven symphonies, 7 or 8 of the Verdi overtures, all with Toscanini's markings there. And I'm handling these things on a table, and it was really, it set you back on your heels to think that you could come in that kind of contact here in New York City with something, 70 or 80 years later. But what I really wanted to say, Mr. Sachs, I wanted to thank you. I've been an avid reader of yours for most of my sort of young and then adult life.
I've been around for a long time.
It beats the alternative. What I want to thank you for is when, in your writing, I remember the first Toscanini book, what stood out to me at the time as incredible day-by-day detail that you managed to document of this man's life. When you looked at any given week of Toscanini's life in your book, you had to go on a rest cure because this man, nobody worked like this man. We don't have the opportunities to do it. No conductor, no pianist, no one in the world works like this. The volume of work. When he was at the Metropolitan Opera conducting 4 performances a week of different operas, rehearsing all day in the upland sherries, up on the roof, you know, it was an incredible volume of work in so many genres, and your books really nailed it hour by hour for me, I have to tell you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Some people would say that, you know, it was too much detail, but you know, I'm glad that some people enjoyed it. In fact, I just want to say that I can't remember the name of the archivist at the Met who died just a couple of years. Yes, that's right. Robert Tuggle told me a few years ago, he said that Toscanini still held the record of most performances in any given season at the Met, you know, 80 years or 100 years later. Obviously, James Levine has conducted more performances than anybody else because he's been there for 45 years. Toscanini was there for only 7 years, but that he still held the record. And some of the schedules that you see where he would do a morning rehearsal, a matinee performance, and an evening performance. You know, of course, the other side of the coin is that productions were not nearly as complicated visually and as far as the acting is concerned as they are today. So, and he in fact took charge of most of the staging elements as well, which does not happen today. Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. But, you know.
You could speak for 2 hours on that.
Yes, exactly, exactly. We'll be here until next week. But anyway, that's that part of the story.
Yes, I have 2 questions. The first one, do we know if Professor Leon Botstein ever had a chance of meeting Toscanini and what the relationship was?
I don't think so because...
He's about our age.
Yes, he's my age, so I was 8 years old when 7 or almost 8 when Toscanini stopped conducting, so I very much doubt that.
Right.
Yeah.
Then I'll pass on to my second question. Do we know what was Toscanini's opinion of Albinoni's Adagio?
No, I don't know. I don't. You know, it's amazing how much, there's a great deal of music that he knew very well but did not conduct. And a lot of Baroque music, this was, don't forget, before all this research into Baroque performing practices. So, for instance, we know from letters that he adored Bach, that he considered the B minor Mass even greater than the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven. But he only conducted a couple of excerpts from it, a couple of choruses, because I think he felt that he did not know how it ought to be performed. I think he conducted 1 or 2 pieces by Albinoni. If you look, there's a link in my book to his repertoire list online. So I don't remember it all by heart. You know.
The reason I asked this question is just the other week my mom told me that she read somewhere that the Adagio of Albinoni was actually composed by a German librarian who was going, sort of restoring libraries after the war. And he then said, oh look, I just found this great thing, the Adagio by Albinoni. Everybody jumped at it, you know, the best conductors conducted, it was played by the best orchestras. And then years later they found out that it was never composed by Albinoni, but actually by this, you know, librarian in the late 40s in Germany. And he just used that trick, like, you know, it made me think of that story of I will play a piece by an unknown composer.
I was about to say it's the same composer.
Right. And you know, I mean, an outstanding example was Fritz Kreisler, the great violinist, who he wrote a lot of pieces that were kind of fake Baroque pieces, and he didn't want his name to appear over and over again, so he made up, this one was by Pugnani, and this one was by somebody else, but they were all written by him.
You spoke about Castellano Tedesco. We are going to have a concert of music by Casanova Tedesco in May in this series, and I would like to know if you know there were some relation between Toscanini and the other musicians who were here in the States, and also with the other people, Italian people who were here.
Yes, very much so. I mean, he was, as far as the musicians were concerned, he actually helped Castelnuovo Tedesco to immigrate to America. And he performed a number of pieces by Castelnuovo, some overtures. Even before Castelnuovo came to America, Toscanini conducted with Jascha Heifetz, he conducted his violin concerto, and with Gregor Piatigorsky, he conducted his cello concerto. So yes, he did, and he did pieces by other Italian exiled composers. Vittorio Rieti was one. He conducted his Sinfonia Tripartita, it's called, etc. So he did do some, and of course he was very friendly with a lot of the musicians who came here. It's interesting, even with composers after the war, the more radical Italian composers whose music Toscanini did not conduct. I mean, he never conducted 12-tone music. But Dalla Piccola came to America, went to visit Toscanini, and they had great conversations, and Dalla Piccola wrote about it, and loved going to hear his performance of Verdi's Ballo in Maschera, and so on. So he kept in touch with what was going on in Italy. As far as the people we saw in the film, he was sort of, especially his son, Walter, but Toscanini himself participated in the Mazzini Society in New York, which was a group of Italian exiles here who, were propagandizing for democratic government in Italy and hoping that that the right choices would be made after the fall of fascism. And after the fall of the regime and after the armistice in September 1943, the society split. There were those who said, yes, we do have to negotiate with the king and with the new Prime Minister Badoglio because they're the ones who were there. And the hardliners, Toscanini, Salvemini, and so on, said, you must not deal with the king and Badoglio. They are the traitors to the country. So the society split down the middle. But he knew many of the other exiles who were living and working here.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your rich and scholarly talents with us. I wish you could read your entire book to us, not just a few letters.
That will take quite a while. I always say people have to be careful picking it up. If you have back problems, it's kind of heavy.
But one of the things in that wonderful book, in addition to the innumerable lessons that he taught us, aside from music, you make a point of saying that he really liked New York and the pulse of New York and enjoyed his time in New York. But this may be a little bit loaded question, but what do you think he would, knowing what he represented, what do you think he would think of New York and the U.S. today?
If you're talking about politics, I think this is a very dangerous area to get into right now. I'm quite sure I know what he would think about that. As far as the city, well, he would be, he's been gone for over 60 years, so he would be shocked by everywhere, every city in the world. I think probably New York is in some ways a more pleasant place to live than it was 60 years ago. But what he loved, yes, was the energy in New York. He liked that very much, and yet when he knew that he was going to be living here on a steady basis, when he really was exiled, in self-imposed exile from Italy, he chose to live in Riverdale outside of the hurly-burly because, you know, he wanted peace and quiet. Also, the house that you saw in the film, Wave Hill, still exists. It's part of a municipal park that belongs to the city of New York. But for most of his years, he lived in a different house, a little bit to the north, a few blocks to the north of that one, which doesn't exist anymore. But what he particularly liked about it was it reminded him of his summer home on the Isolino in Lago Maggiore in Italy, because he could look out over the Hudson, which is so broad at that point that it's almost like a lake. And so he particularly liked that.
Your question that made me think of another question we might ask is, what would Toscanini think if he were to see what the classical music world of today, especially in the United States, is and what it has become? I think on the one hand, he'd be probably very happy and pleased at the very high technical prowess of the succeeding generations instrumentally. I have a very hard time believing that he would be comfortable with the degree that image has replaced substance in many aspects of our musical life. How media, as opposed to just simply the music itself, has changed the entire landscape. It's just a fantasy, but I can very well imagine he would be deeply uncomfortable with that as well. I will also not speak of politics, but I am very sure what he would have thought about some things that we're experiencing today.
Yes, and we could also include opera staging, another...
He would have hated it.
Yes.
You know, nobody likes to talk about it, but until very, very comparatively recently in history, the conductor staged the opera. I mean, you could barely mention that anymore. I've actually staged one opera, by the way, but I purposely did not take credit for it, but I was amused by, and this was in Paris. It was actually a semi-staged performance of Die Meistersinger, which I had a fantastic cast, and it was a decision that it would be a concert performance. And then I went to my boss and I said, well, you know, do you mind if we put the pit down and we have it? He said, it's yours. You do what you like with it. So we sort of in 7 or 8 hours with a very experienced cast, I sort of directed the whole thing, but then specifically didn't put my name to it. And I was amazed at the same critics who, you know, would quite regularly, you know, murder all of us at the Paris Opera, me included, were full of praise for the simplicity and the genius of seeing Wagner's work without all of the trappings of modern, you know, modern productions. Had I put my name to it, I would have been lacerated. It wasn't that long ago that the stage director was the conductor.
Speaking of the Meistersinger, I think I put this in the book. Toscanini mentioned in one of these taped conversations that when he did his first Meistersinger at La Scala in 1898, he said in the second part of the third act, when there are the crowd scenes, he said the chorus, you know, they were sort of lackadaisical, like they didn't know what to do. And so he said, I said to them, pretend that Garibaldi has just arrived and there's a big greeting for him. And he said, that did it. They all reacted properly at that point.
I have, so first of all, thank you for the talk. I have a question for Maestro Conlon about the video that we saw, especially when we saw Toscanini conducting on stage. I noticed that the style and maybe the technique of conducting, it's probably different from today's style, especially I noticed the use of left hand. It's very limited, and I would say sober compared to today's use of left hand, which is very, very emphasized, especially in symphonic music. So
I also was noticing it because it had never struck me as dramatically as it did, that he rarely used it. I would say that sober is a good description of his entire approach to conducting concerts.
As compared to today's conducting.
Well, I think that's part of what I was referring to in terms of image over substance. You know, the genius of Toscanini was what took place in the rehearsals. And so I think his attitude, you can correct me, Harvey, if I'm wrong, is that by the time it came to the concert was that it was prepared, it was ready, everybody knew what they were supposed to do, and it wasn't necessary to put on a show, as many people do, on the podium, because everybody knew it. So it was really very simple. This is the time they knew what he wanted. His eyes, as you can see, are extremely expressive, and he. I mean, I think it's a lesson to all of us. How little it is possible to actually do. I mean, it's very, very, very simple. But what's not simple is what it represented, what came out of it, and why he didn't need to do more was because of what he had done in the rehearsals. That's at least my interpretation. I don't know, Harvey, if you agree with me.
Absolutely, and there is one film, lasts just a few minutes, that his son took of him conducting a rehearsal in 1939, I think. There's no sound with the film, it's just visual. But his gestures in rehearsal could be very wild. You know, he's trying to get everything out of the orchestra, and his technique was very often 3 bars ahead of a change of tempo or something. He would call out to the orchestra what was about to happen to save time. And the orchestra, as you know, love saving time. They do not like being bored at rehearsals. So his technique in rehearsal was totally different from his technique in performance. There are a lot of conductors today of whom one could also say that, but in the opposite sense. Sitting at rehearsals and then at the performance adding the choreography. So yeah, that was his. But in that I have to say, he was not alone. When you watch films of most of the old-time conductors who didn't know what a television camera was, they tended to be very controlled in their gestures, because what was the point of not being controlled? Yeah, it's I think typical of his modus operandi. There are, the 10 televised concerts that were preserved from the period 1948 to 52, and some of them are not terribly interesting from the conducting point of view, but there are some that are quite amazing. I mean, there's an Andante from the Mozart G minor symphony where you watch how he is watching and listening to everything that's going on, and the minutest gesture has an instantaneous effect on the orchestra. There's also a Nuage from the Nocturnes of Debussy. Same thing. Quite remarkable. So yeah, he was a pretty good conductor. He says in one of the tapes, I hope that maybe I'll be remembered as a pretty good conductor. He actually says that in one of the tapes. Yes. Oh, should we?
Yeah.
We have to end.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you can come and ask me, but we have to end the evening there.
Thank you.